Hi, Journeyers. I'm Tony Carnes, your host for A Journey Through NYC Religions Television. Welcome to the program. Today, we're going to talk about one of our notable pastors here in New York City, Reverend Timothy Keller. And this is anticipation of a new book coming out, a intellectual and spiritual biography by Collin Hansen, who we have today with us. Welcome, Collin.
Oh, it's great to be here, Tony. Thank you.
Well, I've read your book and it's quite interesting. I discovered a number of new things. I discovered a number of new questions. If I could ask you just to start off, who is Tim Keller? What's his headline? What is his big headline? If you had to say, this is the big headline about Tim Keller today, what would it be?
It's a great question, Tony. There's a number of different directions we could go with that answer, but I think the simplest way to put it is that he has been the leading figure in the re-engagement of evangelical Protestants in the United States and around the world at city, center, urban ministry. So to put it simply, if you want to look at it locally in New York, I would certainly say that 70s and the 1980s were a nadir in many ways about city center ministry in Manhattan. The borough's obviously a different situation, but city center ministry had really been in a long-term decline, and Tim Keller is more responsible, humanly speaking, than anyone else for the significant growth of urban ministry among evangelical Protestants in the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
Well, how is he responsible for that?
Well, one, he came to New York to plant a church. That was not the most common thing back then. Now it's become much more commonplace all over the world, and certainly around New York, with dozens and dozens of churches, new churches that have been started since he got there. So he came from Philadelphia in 1989. He's a native of Eastern Pennsylvania. He and his wife, Kathy, was a native of Western Pennsylvania. They started Redeemer Presbyterian Church. And almost immediately, the church grew tremendously beyond all expectations, beyond all other standards for evangelical churches, really, and any other kinds of Christian churches in New York at that time. And since then, like I said, dozens and dozens of churches around Manhattan, as well as in the boroughs and in the suburbs as well of New York City.
Well, let me set this up. You set it up well. New York was in trouble in the 70s and 80s. It was a very troubled city. The police nicknamed it Fear City and handed out pamphlets at the JFK airport warning people about visiting New York. And the Kellers were ensconced in Philadelphia at a seminary in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And all of a sudden, his denomination, which is the Presbyterian Church of America, decided they want to plant a new church in Manhattan Center City. Now, I have a couple of questions about this. One is, what was the understanding of New York City among this group of PCA Presbyterian leaders, and why would they want to start a church in a city that they probably thought was pretty hard to start a church at?
These are logical questions. One of the interesting aspects of the Presbyterian Church in America is that it is the successor in many ways to the Southern Presbyterian Church. So the support base, the economic base, the kind of political base and everything for the Presbyterian Church in America is largely in the South. And it only started when Tim and Kathy had just graduated from seminary up in Boston in the mid-1970s. And so the Presbyterian, it's really many different ironies there, but Tim worked for an aspect, a ministry of the PCA called Mission to North America. And one of the things Mission to North America was doing through some other leaders who'd be well known around New York, such as Terry Geiger, they were interested in being able to continue to expand the reach and the spread of the gospel of Jesus Christ outside of simply the South, but especially into aspects of the North. And as you know, and as your viewers will know, New York always has that significant place in people's mindset. And there had been some earlier efforts to try to start churches in that area, simply to be able to help other people to get to know Jesus in a personal way and to become his disciples. But they had largely been underfunded. The differences when Tim and Kathy moved to New York were, number one, that they were supported far more generously by the Presbyterian Church than anyone else had been before, which allowed them to be able to settle on Roosevelt Island and to be able to raise their family and with the prospects of staying. But the second thing that dramatically changed was that there was actually a pretty significant revival happening as New York was changing, especially with a lot of the financial transformations and these so-called yuppies, the Wall Street yuppies that were coming in. There was a significant spiritual movement among them, and that's really the wave of interest in the gospel that the Kellers found when they moved to New York.
Now, your book is Timothy Keller. You can see in the back, you can audience, you can order it by Collin Hansen. And we're talking about Tim Keller and his significance both to the city and actually to the global evangelical Protestant movement. Now, the city wasn't doing well, as you say, but all of a sudden, he starts a church, officially started in 1989, mm-hmm. and starts to grow. And then after 2000, the number of the like churches or similar churches exploded, so that over 50% of the evangelical Protestant churches in Manhattan today were started after 2000. It's a very recent movement. Now, if you would say, what are the signs of his success in Manhattan? One of them is, of course, the number of churches. What other signs of success have you seen about Reverend Keller's ministry?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. This might come from my perspective as somebody. I lived northern New Jersey. I lived in outside of Chicago for much of my career and adult life. I now live in Birmingham, Alabama. I'll tell you one of the signs of success. One of the things that changed is when people would inevitably move from different parts of the country, especially the Midwest and the South, with larger evangelical populations. The change came from the 70s and 80s and early 90s, where if you said, I'm moving to New York, people would say, oh, no, that is so terrible. You can't do that. You'll ruin your faith. You'll get mugged, all this sort of stuff. And the transformation was after 9/11, especially, the attitude was more of, oh, wow, are you going to go to Redeemer Presbyterian Church? Are you going to listen to Tim Keller preach? Now, this is not what Tim was intending. He did not want to become this celebrity. He moved to New York to try to reach New Yorkers with the gospel. But one of the main signs of success of Redeemer has been that as people inevitably move in and out of New York, as they do so commonly, there's often been just this expectation that, of course, there are many, many thriving evangelical Protestant churches across the city. That simply was not the case in the 70s and 80s and early 90s.
Now, part of what happened is that Tim Keller is a Reformed Protestant. Maybe we should let our audience know, what is a Reformed Protestant? I mean, we thought there was something called Christian, and then we thought there was something called Protestant and Catholic. Yeah. What is a Reformed Protestant?
Well, in some ways, you could go back to the Reformation and see there were several different offshoots of Protestantism. We know about Lutheranism from Luther. We know about Anglicanism from the Church of England. The Reformed movement was especially pronounced in parts of Germany, parts of Switzerland, parts of England, and we're thinking about the Puritan movement, and then especially in places like the Netherlands and Amsterdam. So in that sense, when we think about New York's history of New Amsterdam, we think there's always been this Reformed branch of Protestantism, which tends to have a larger interest than other branches of Protestantism in working themselves out in the culture, about putting their faith into practice in their vocations, in their communities, in their neighborhoods. That's really distinguished them. And then, of course, as you know, Tony, we can jump ahead to 1857 and 1858, really the largest revival in American history, which had its origins in New York City, that came out of an old Dutch Reformed church and Jeremiah Lanphier and his work. So in one sense, it's deeply rooted in New York's history, but it has this global reach to where now you would find significant Reformed movements in places like Brazil, in places like South Korea and South Africa, and all kinds of different places in between.
Well, by the way, audience, if you want to know more about the 1857 Laban's Prayer Revival, we have a article. You can look under a tab under retrospectives. We have an article with never before published photos from that movement, actually engravings, and also we dug into the archives to produce many new insights on that movement. It's a short piece, and take a look at it. It was a very big deal in New York and around the globe. And then Keller comes along, and he's a reformer, which means he Reformed Protestant, which you say is you want to change the city. Well, how is he trying to change the city?
One of the distinguishing aspects of Keller's movement and Redeemer from the very beginning was they wanted to say that they were a church for the city, a church for the city. And there was a sense in which other evangelicals had come and they were scared of the city. They were sectioned off from the city. They were maybe a counterculture or almost in some ways an underground movement within the city. They said they wanted to be a church for the city. So one of the first things that those early Redeemer members, late 1980s, early 1990s did is they prayed fervently for the city. And one of the things that they prayed about was the crime rates. And so when you talk to these early Redeemer members, as I did for the book, they said, we believe that's what happened. That's why the crime rates declined. Forget Mayor Giuliani and forget maybe those were proximate means that God used, the broken windows policies and policing and things like that. But Redeemer Presbyterian Church members believed that that was an answer to prayer from the Lord, the decreasing crime in the city. Another thing that was really significant, especially after September 11th, 2001, is that they believed that it was important for them to stay. And they had a model for that as they studied the work of a sociologist named Rodney Stark about the growth of Christianity in Rome, early Rome. And what they found is that those people who stayed amid tragedy, the Christians who stayed, ministered to their neighbors and helped contribute to a growing Christian movement that, of course, we all know so well and have seen transform the world. And they believed that, especially in that moment, in that tragedy of September 11th, that apocalypse of September 11, 2001, it was important that they love their neighbors simply by staying put and not fleeing and not leaving the city. So those were a couple of the tangible ways. And we could also expand on the remarkable movement of Hope for New York. They believed from the very beginning that they needed to pair preaching the gospel of individual transformation, salvation, deliverance from God's judgment and into heaven, with significant ministry to the down and out, to the homeless, to the poor of the city. And so Hope for New York was part of Tim Keller's vision for Redeemer Presbyterian Church from the very beginning as well.
Well, I wonder, partly Tim has become known for his sermons, his that the way to motivate this change that you're talking about is that he tries them out into his sermons.
Yeah.
He's almost like a strategist in his sermons. He says, I want to think about what we should next do, and let me do some sermons on it. And then he lays that out for the congregation, like for starting, helping a nonprofit Compassion Ministries under the banner of Hope for New York, or helping people to work in a Christianly way, like the Center for Faith and Work, which they have at Redeemer, and or plant churches. Often he would actually from the very beginning, he would write out his thinking about that and give them out in sermons, which made it more depthful. How does he prepare for his sermons? Are you familiar with what kind of process he does in preparing for his sermons?
Um, I don't have the greatest depth in that. One of the things I've always noticed about Tim's preaching is that it's not necessarily transferable. The focus of the book is on the influences on Tim, and I'm not sure, Tony, that you could really find another parallel of preachers who brings so many different sources to mind. So it's one of the things that's very clear with Tim is that he simply reads prodigiously. And one of the things I talk about in the book is how when people would listen to him preach in New York, they couldn't peg him because he'd be quoting from Woody Allen films. He'd be quoting from The Village Voice. He'd be quoting from The Atlantic. He'd be quoting from The New Yorker. And then he would be talking about assuaging God's wrath through penal substitutionary atonement. He'd talk about the exclusivity, the necessity of believing explicitly in Christ for salvation. People's categories were blown. So one of the things that just distinguishes Tim in his preparation for preaching is simply how widely and expansively he would read. But it was never simply combining all these different newspapers. Like it wasn't just combining the Post with the Times or something like that in some kind of synthesis. It was all driving toward the scriptures themselves, which is where his deep reading originated, the close reading of the text that he learned early on as a college student through University Christian Fellowship at Bucknell University. So, I mean, it's very hard to be able to emulate not only how much and how widely he reads, but also how much he retains and how he has an eye for translating that. So that's what I know about that sermon preparation process, but it's very uncommon for any kinds of preachers today.
The way he reads is very detailed.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at his notes and markings on something he reads, it's like everything is marked up on his page. Have you seen one of these pages that he's marked up from his reading?
I have, and it is it's like one of those beautiful mind kind of situations where there's all these connections and
right.
You can't make heads or tails of it.
Yeah, you see it and you say, this is a madman that's marking here. I mean, it's so marked up, but it's and sometimes with color, but certainly arrows and little notes and then underlining and then more notes in between, interlinear notes. And what's amazing about it is that he sorts all of that out into a comprehensible, as you say, not a mishmash, but a synthesis. And I believe that one of Tim's greatest strengths is that he can come into a situation or to a paper or to a talk, and he discerns intuitively, based on probably long practice, of exactly what the heart is, exactly what, as in newspaper world we would call the headline is. He would pick it up very, very quickly. And he's had also in his preaching, he's had a big impact on the church in United States, particularly in promoting sort of a new reform movement, which you wrote a book about called Young, Restless, and Reformed, right?
I did. Yeah, what I found, Tony, in working on this book is that in many ways what Tim and Kathy had gone through as young adults in college, in their respective colleges, and then at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary north of Boston, was really a 1970s version of what I found in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So it wasn't a coincidence that Tim Keller became one of the key leaders of that emerging Reformed movement that I wrote about in the 1990s and 2000s, because he himself had walked that same path as really an outgrowth of the Jesus movement revival in the 1960s and 1970s. So that was one of the surprising findings, I would say, when I was working on this book.
Now, is this Kellerite inspired reform movement still going, or are we in a malaise now with all of the problems we have in America? Is it
Well,
going to stop?
yeah, every revival movement has a start and it has an end. Otherwise, it would just be the norm. So, in many ways, what you're seeing is a kind of dynamic movement that has institutionalized. And in fact, Tim himself has written extensively about this, especially in his textbook Center Church. Talks about the relationship between movement dynamics and institutions. And so, what you see now is through a lot of different institutions that Tim himself had invested in, including my employer, the Gospel Coalition. You see that institutional expression of that revival movement, sources for churches and churches around the world. You also see that in all the churches that continue to thrive in New York. You have a little bit less of some of the dynamism of a movement, but you have more of the settled presence of an institution. And so
Now,
go ahead.
well, now I want to pick up something right here. Is that you work for one of these institutions for
Exactly. Right.
10 years or so?
Yeah, since 2010, since I graduated seminary.
So I wonder, you must work with Tim quite often. What's he like as a person?
Tim is very consistent in terms of who he is in public and who he is in private. The voice that you hear from him in his books and in his preaching is very similar to what he's like in person. And one of the things I found talking with people for the book, talking with many of his closest friends, long-term friends, his colleagues at Redeemer, is that the people who are close to him, they don't idolize him. They know him and Kathy to be real people, but they deeply admire them. And that is something special at a time when we've, for understandable reasons, grown very cynical about church leaders from a lot of the things that we see in the headlines. And a lot of what you see in this book is true to life from Tim. What he loves to do is not talk about himself. What he loves to talk about is what he's reading. So you get a lot of that, kind of a tour through his intellectual and spiritual influences from the Bible on out in all these expansive ways over time. But that's when you're around him, that's what he wants to talk about. He wants to talk about ideas. He is endlessly curious, both intellectually and spiritually, always looking to grow, including through this current situation where he's battling against pancreatic cancer.
Does he share much about that with you from time to time, or does he avoid talking about the personal?
Well, we definitely talk about the personal as well because of the significant implications for so much of the work that is happening around the world. Tim's I mean, his personal spiritual growth and his personal health has just significant implications for a ministry like where I lead at the Gospel Coalition. So, we do a women's conference every couple years, and that conference was hitting this last year during an especially difficult time for his health, where we really thought we might lose him. And and there are just really hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people who have read his books, listened to his sermons, and including presidents. I mean, Tim's health is a matter of interest for President Bush and President Obama, both of whom he has spent a significant amount of time with. And so I think in New York, in some ways, it's the least likely place to recognize the extent of his influence. And yet, if you were to go to London or to Sydney, Australia, or to Nashville, Tennessee, or any of these other places, you'd certainly be able to recognize Tim as one of the most significant religious leaders of the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
How is his health right now?
I've continued to say it's as good as it could be, at least at the time that we're talking here, at least as good as it could be when you have a pancreatic cancer diagnosis where we have no known cure. But what we do know is that he's got the best possible treatment. In fact, he was I think if not the first person where they were bringing him into the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland for treatment after when COVID opened up again for other kinds of treatments back in early 2020. And so he's continued to have that excellent treatment, and every report so far has been positive. We just always know it's against the backdrop of something that where there's no known cure.
Is he down in DC now or in New York, or goes back and forth?
Largely in New York, but he goes back and forth for the treatments. And
How
so
is he handling his illness? I mean, this is he was a very vigorous, intelligent man. He's close to his wife, Kathy.
very close, yeah.
How has he dealt with this illness?
Well, you know what's interesting, Tony? I've known Tim for a really long time. I have never seen him so spiritually vibrant as he is right now, and so interested in investing in the next generation of leaders, of supporting them, of encouraging them. He's always fascinating to talk with, but there has been really a remarkable spiritual vibrancy to him. And in some ways, he seems to enjoy being freed from some of the many obligations and responsibilities that he's accrued over time to be able to focus on what he loves doing, talking with people, especially spending time with Kathy and seeking spiritual renewal, especially in prayer with God. And so it's really been a remarkable thing to see.
Now, he was a co-chair and one of the founders of the the Gospel Coalition. Is he still co-chair, or has he stepped back from that?
Yeah, he co-chairs our, so I have the role of vice president, which is analogous to most of the role that he had through his time there, but he's now the vice chair of our board. So he remains closely involved. And in fact, we've got some plans in terms of how to grow in some of the areas related to
I better wrap it up here. Thank you. I'm sorry to just start wrap it up fast, but we've got a certain amount of time. I do want to remind people about your book, Collin Hansen. His book, it's the spiritual and intellectual biography of Tim Keller. I think you'll find it a fascinating read. There'll be many different things. You also have a podcast called Gospel Bound. Is that right?
That's correct. Gospel Bound, yes.
And your website is the Gospel Coalition. So we really thank you for being with us here. And we hope this book just sells boundless. And my name's Tony Carnes. I'm your host for A Journey Through NYC Religions Television. Thank you for being with us. Bye-bye.